On the night of March 27, 1973, the world's most prestigious awards ceremony was taking place at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, and 85 million people were glued to their televisions, holding their breath, because it was almost certain that Marlon Brando would win the Oscar for Best Actor for his legendary performance as Vito Corleone in The Godfather. The hall was filled with Hollywood's brightest stars: Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, Jane Fonda, and they were all waiting for Brando to take the stage and accept that golden statue, because this was not just an Oscar, it was a comeback story. For 10 years, Brando had been Hollywood's has-been. His last films had all flopped, but The Godfather had crowned him once more. And tonight was the official coronation. When Liv Ullmann and Roger Moore opened the envelope and read Marlon Brando's name, the room erupted in applause. The spotlights turned to his empty seat, but Brando wasn't there. As the cameras scanned the crowd, people looked at each other in shock because Marlon Brando had said he would attend the ceremony. He had accepted the invitation, but his seat was empty. Then someone emerged from the side stage door and the world froze. A young woman with long black hair and traditional Native American clothing walked toward the microphone. Her name was Sacheen Littlefeather, and she had a message from Marlon Brando. At that moment, 85 million people watching were shocked because no one had ever seen anything like this. For the first time in Oscar history, an actor was protesting an award. Sacheen's hands trembled slightly as she took the microphone, but her voice was clear. She explained that Marlon Brando could not accept the Oscar and cited the film industry's treatment of Native American peoples and the Wounded Knee Massacre as the reason. The room fell silent. Then boos began. Some stood up and applauded, while others whistled and cursed. And in that moment, the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion turned into a battlefield. When Sacheen finished her speech and left the Oscar statue behind as she walked off stage, no one knew that Marlon Brando had just done more than refuse an award. He had sacrificed his career, his legacy, and his entire relationship with Hollywood, and the revenge that would begin the next morning was only just starting. If these kinds of secret Hollywood stories interest you, please remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now I'm telling the full story of that night and Brando's war against the FBI. When Marlon Brando's FBI file was first opened in 1947, he was only 23 years old, and the reason was that he was learning the Konstantin Stanislavski method at the Actor Studio for the FBI. This Russian influence meant communist sympathies. Those years were the height of America's Cold War paranoia, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover saw the red menace everywhere, especially in Hollywood, because movies could influence millions of people. And Hoover feared this propaganda machine would fall into communist hands. Brando was just starting to gain recognition on Broadway with A Streetcar Named Desire at the time, and was not yet a political figure. But his friends at the Actors Studio were different. Elia Kazan, Stella Adler, Lee Strasberg had all been involved in left-wing theater movements in the 1930s, and the FBI was closely monitoring them. Brando's name first appeared in an FBI report as a potential sympathizer with close ties to Kazan and was noted for continued surveillance. The real surveillance intensified in the early 1950s when the McCarthy era began, as the Hollywood witch hunt was in full swing and Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist hunt had begun questioning artists through the House Un-American Activities Committee. In 1952, Elia Kazan testified before the committee and named his former Communist Party member friends. This betrayal deeply shook Brando because Kazan was his mentor and father figure. Brando never forgave Kazan, and this rift was added to his FBI file. Noting that Brando criticized Kazan's testimony and that his communist sympathies had grown stronger. In reality, Brando was not a communist. He was simply opposed to injustice. But for the FBI, this distinction was irrelevant. The 1960s were years of political awakening for Brando because he was in the midst of the American civil rights movement and was too angry to remain silent. When he attended Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington in 1963, FBI agents took photos of Brando in the crowd and noted in his file that he was present at the MLK March, marking the beginning of his black rights activism. In the years that followed, Brando became even more radical. He supported the Black Panther Party, protested the police killing of Bobby Hutton, and visited the Black Panther offices in Oakland. This set off alarm bells for the FBI because the Black Panthers were at the top of the FBI's list of internal enemies, and Hoover had labeled the Panthers the country's greatest threat. Brando's relationship with the Panthers thickened his file and landed him on Hoover's special interest list. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 1968, Brando flew to Memphis and spoke at the funeral, criticizing America's structural racism and saying that it wasn't just a trigger man who killed King, but everyone's silence. This speech was so powerful that it made the front page of the New York Times the next day and caught the FBI's full attention. The day after that speech, an FBI agent visited Brando's manager, Mike Medavoy, and told him that his client was in dangerous waters and needed to keep quiet if he wanted to continue working in Hollywood. This was a clear threat, and Medavoy immediately warned Brando. But Brando just laughed and didn't take the FBI seriously. Because he was the founder of method acting, the world's greatest actor, and he thought no one could stop him. But this arrogance would cost Brando dearly, because underestimating the FBI in the 1960s was tantamount to suicide, and Brando was about to learn that. In the months that followed, strange things began to happen. Brando's phone lines were constantly crackling, unknown cars were parked around his house, and most importantly, Hollywood studios began to distance themselves from Brando. In 1969, he played an anti-colonialist role in the film Burn, and the film flopped. But the real problem was on the film set because director Gillo Pontecorvo said they felt Brando was constantly being watched. Was Brando becoming paranoid, or was he really being followed? When FBI files were made public in 2011, the truth emerged. Yes, Brando was under intense surveillance in the late 1960s, and FBI reports documented his every move. His phone calls were tapped, his letters were read, and agents were sent to every meeting he attended. The FBI's goal was clear: to silence Brando, either voluntarily or by force. By the early 1970s, Brando's career had hit rock bottom. His last 5 films had all flopped. Studios had labeled him unreliable, difficult, and overly political. And according to Hollywood gossip, Brando was finished. But in 1971, Francis Ford Coppola offered him the role of Vito Corleone. And when The Godfather hit theaters in 1972, it changed cinema history. Marlon Brando was resurrected overnight, no longer a has-been, but hailed as the world's greatest actor. Vito Corleone's hushed voice, piercing gaze, and iconic performance were Oscar-worthy. But for Brando, this triumph was not just an acting achievement. It was a weapon, because he now had a platform to stand up to the FBI's threats. The success of The Godfather had given Brando a sense of invincibility, and he was preparing to unleash the anger he had suppressed for years. In February 1973, members of the Oglala Lakota Sioux and American Indian movement activists occupied Wounded Knee Village on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to protest the federal government's Native American policies. A symbolic act of resistance at Wounded Knee, the site where 300 Lakota were massacred by the U.S. Army in 1890. The FBI and federal marshals surrounded the village. Clashes continued for 61 days, and the media broadcast it worldwide. Brando's heart bled as he watched the news on television, because the scene reminded him of Martin Luther King's funeral. Again, a marginalized group. Again, government oppression. Again, media indifference. Dennis Banks, one of the leaders of the American Indian movement, was charismatic, courageous, and determined, and Brando decided to reach out to him. In March 1973, Brando secretly flew to South Dakota, and the FBI recorded this trip. He met with Dennis Banks near Wounded Knee, and the meeting lasted several hours. Brando told Banks he could use his voice and do something there as the Oscars approached, and Banks trusted him because Hollywood stars usually avoided political risks. But Brando was different. When Brando returned to Los Angeles, he had a plan in mind. If he won the Oscar for The Godfather, he would speak out for Native American rights at the ceremony and refuse the Oscar because he wanted a real protest, not a symbolic gesture. But how would he do it? If he just went up and spoke, the media might label him a crazy Hollywood star, and the message could be lost. Another idea came to Brando. Sacheen Littlefeather, a 26-year-old Apache and Yaqui activist and president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee. Brando had met her a few months earlier at an activist meeting and had been impressed by Sacheen's courage. At the end of March, Brando invited Sacheen to his home in Beverly Hills and explained his plan. He wanted her to take the stage in his place at the Oscars and refuse the award. Sacheen froze because this was unbelievable. The Oscars were watched by 85 million people. It was Hollywood's most sacred night, and Brando wanted her to protest. Sacheen's initial reaction was fear, but then she thought about it, talked to her family, and finally agreed because she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. It was a historic opportunity for 85 million people to hear the Native American voice. A week before the Oscars, Brando's lawyer, Norman Gary, encountered a mysterious package in his office. The courier had dropped it off and left quickly, and there was no return address. When Gary opened the package, a thick envelope came out, and inside the envelope were photographs, black and white, professionally taken, undercover surveillance photos. The first photo showed Marlon Brando and Richard Pryor in a close position in a house. The second photo showed Brando and a young James Dean caught in intimate moments at a party in the 1950s. And the third photo showed Brando sharing private moments with Wally Cox at the actor's studio. Gary's hand trembled because these photos could have ended Brando's career. In 1970s America, bisexuality was still a huge scandal, and Hollywood would never forgive it. Inside the envelope was also a letter, typed and unsigned. It said that the client was planning to make a political speech at the Oscars. And if he did, these photos would be on the front page of every newspaper the next day. The choice was Brando's. Silence or scandal. Gary immediately called Brando and explained, in a panic, someone was blackmailing him. They were very dangerous photos. He had to cancel the Oscar plan. Brando listened quietly, then took a deep breath and asked who had sent the photos. Gary didn't know, but Brando did. The FBI. Because some of these photos were so old and so specific that only an organization that had been monitoring him for years could have obtained them. Brando stayed up all night, chain smoking, and by morning he had made his decision. He would not back down because backing down would mean the FBI had won. Brando had never bowed to anyone in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. The next morning, he called Sacheen and told her the plan was still on, that she needed to be ready, that he would take the stage on Oscar night and deliver the message. Sacheen gathered her courage and agreed. Brando also instructed his lawyer. If the FBI released those photos, he would immediately hold a press conference and confess everything, saying he was bisexual, that he was with Richard, and that he was also with James. He would have nothing left to hide, and the FBI would have no leverage against him. This was Brando's brilliant strategy. He was taking the blackmail weapon out of the FBI's hands, because if he revealed his secret himself, the blackmail would become worthless. As Oscar night approached, Brando was calm, ready, and felt free for the first time in years, because he had nothing left to lose. March 27, 1973, the moment of suicide. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was packed on Oscar night. 3,000 guests, hundreds of press members, and television cameras broadcasting live to the world. Marlon Brando sat at home, turned on the TV, and watched the ceremony. He wouldn't be on stage, but he would follow every moment because Sacheen was there, and that young woman would fight Brando's fight. When Sacheen arrived at the ceremony building that night in traditional Apache attire, the security guards were surprised. Her long black hair, her leather-trimmed dress, and the look of determination on her face. Backstage, Oscar producer Howard Koch approached Sacheen and said in a threatening voice that if she spoke for more than 5 minutes, security would remove her from the stage. Sacheen nodded, but was inwardly terrified because Koch's voice was genuinely threatening. This was not just an organizational rule, but a clear warning. Sacheen sat in the waiting room, clasped her hands together, and recited the speech Brando had given her from memory. The hall was packed, and the Best Actor category was approaching. The nominees appeared on screen. Marlon Brando, Michael Caine, Laurence Olivier, Peter O'Toole, Paul Winfield. Everyone knew Brando would win because his performance as Vito Corleone was legendary, and critics had chosen him as the year's Best Actor. When Liv Ullmann and Roger Moore took the stage, the excitement in the room was at its peak. They opened the envelope, paused for a moment, and then announced that the winner was Marlon Brando. The room rose to its feet, applause erupted, and the cameras turned to his empty seat. Brando was nowhere to be seen. People looked at each other. Some whispered where he was. And then the side stage door opened. When Sacheen Littlefeather appeared, the hall fell silent. Who was this woman? Why was she on stage in traditional dress? Roger Moore, stunned, held out the Oscar statue. But Sacheen raised her hand and refused it, not accepting the award. She approached the microphone, 85 million people watching held their breath, and Sacheen began to speak. She introduced herself, said she was Apache and president of the National Native American Affirmative Image Committee, explained that she was representing Marlon Brando and that he was deeply sorry but could not accept this generous award. The room froze. Some gasped in shock, some shook their heads, and some rose angrily. Sachin continued, citing as reasons the film industry's current treatment of Native Americans, the images portrayed on television and in film reruns, and the recent events at Wounded Knee. As soon as she said this, boos began. The room was divided, with some liberals applauding, while some conservatives whistled and shouted, "Shame!" Sachin tried to remain calm, but her hands were shaking. She wanted to continue, but Howard Koch signaled from backstage for her to stop, and the orchestra began to play. Sachin couldn't finish her speech before the microphone was cut off, but she left the Oscar statue, held her head high, and walked off stage. That moment made television history. An Oscar had been refused for the first time, and 85 million people witnessed it. When the ceremony ended, chaos ensued. Backstage reporters swamped Sachin. Security guards immediately escorted her out of the building. And the Oscar producers were in a panic because they had lost control of the live broadcast. John Wayne was said to be furious. Rumor has it, he yelled backstage that he wanted to throw that Indian girl off the stage. When Clint Eastwood took the stage, he made an ironic joke, saying he didn't know whether to present the award on behalf of all the cowboys shot in John Ford westerns. The audience laughed, but it was a tense and uncomfortable laugh because everyone was in shock. Brando turned off the TV at home, put out his cigarette, and when the phone started ringing, he unplugged the cord. He didn't want to talk to anyone because he already knew what they would say. When Sachin returned to her hotel that night, she found death threats under her door. Notes saying, "We will kill you." When the newspapers came out the next morning, the headlines were brutal. Brando insults Hollywood. Oscar scandal. Marlon's political stunt backfires. Variety wrote that Brando's Oscar refusal was not artistic courage, but political arrogance. And Hollywood would not forgive it. And Hollywood truly did not forgive. Revenge. The Blacklist. 2 days after the Oscar ceremony, on the morning of March 29, 1973, the heads of Hollywood's major studios held an emergency meeting. Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, MGM, all gathered and discussed the Brando issue. Robert Evans explained that Brando had crossed the line. The Oscars were Hollywood's most sacred night, and he had turned it into a political circus. If no response was given, tomorrow every actor would use the Oscar stage as a protest podium. Universal President Lew Wasserman joined in and made a suggestion. None of them should ever give him a leading role. Again, an unofficial blacklist should be enforced. The MGM president also supported this, and the decision was made. Marlon Brando was now persona non grata in Hollywood. This blacklist was not official and could not be proven in court, but it was very real. The studio presidents made a pact. No roles for Brando. Results began to appear that week. Brando's agent received rejections from 5 different projects. The first rejection came from Francis Ford Coppola, who wanted him to play the young Vito Corleone in The Godfather Part 2. But Paramount was clear. No Brando, no money. Coppola was helpless. He wanted to defend Brando, but the studio resorted to threats and said they would either shoot the film without Brando or not shoot it at all. Coppola tearfully accepted and gave the role to Robert De Niro. The second rejection came from Arthur Penn. Brando had been offered the lead role in Missouri Breaks, but the studio suddenly cited budget problems and withdrew the offer. The third rejection even came from Elia Kazan. Years later, he wanted to make peace and offered a new project, but the studio refused to provide financing. Brando realized this was no coincidence. It was a systematic boycott. Mike Medavoy helplessly explained that Hollywood was punishing him and that he needed to keep quiet for a while. But Brando stubbornly refused and said he would be even more vocal. In April 1973, he went to Wounded Knee, took photos with the protesters, and gave interviews to the press. Every move was added to his FBI file. Every statement further angered Hollywood. But the real revenge came from elsewhere, the FBI and the IRS. A week after the Oscars, Brando's lawyer received a letter from the IRS. A tax audit would examine Brando's 1972 tax returns due to irregularities. This was no coincidence. The FBI was using the IRS to pressure Brando because even Al Capone had gone to prison for tax evasion. And the same method was being applied to Brando. For the next 3 years, Brando battled the tax courts, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees, and finally settled the case. But the message had been sent. You cannot defy the FBI. Brando's phone lines continued to be tapped. His home remained under surveillance, and every project he took on was reported to the studios by the FBI. This man is risky. This man is problematic. This man is dangerous. In the years that followed, Brando could only land small roles. His role as Kurtz in Apocalypse Now became iconic, but only had 10 minutes of screen time. And his role as Jor-El in Superman paid well, but was still a small part. Brando never again became a leading actor like he was before The Godfather. And it wasn't just because of his age or weight. It was Hollywood's and the FBI's silent revenge. When Brando died in 2004, some newspapers remembered him as a cinema legend, others as a political activist. But no one asked, what did Brando lose when he refused that Oscar? The answer was simple: everything. But Brando always said the same thing in the years that followed. He never wanted that Oscar in the first place. But saying what he said that night, shouting the truth, was more valuable to him than a golden statue. And perhaps he was right, because the 1973 Oscar night was not just a protest. It was a man's decision to be true to his conscience, no matter the cost. Marlon Brando sacrificed his career that night, but saved his soul, and went down in history as the man who fought the FBI, refused to bow to Hollywood, and stood alone in front of 85 million people